An unsurpassed and penetrating wisdom is rarely met with, even in 100,000 million kalpas. Having it to see and listen to, remember and accept, I vow to taste the truth of the Tathagata's teachings.
In Buddhism, when Zen practitioners share their understandings of the teachings and practice, it's offered on the basis of dana paramita. Dana is a Pali word that means generosity or to give freely, and this is done without any expectation when the opportunity arises. Those who share the teachings at Great Tree do so on a dana basis, so please support their practice by giving what you can. Tori has very generously offered her dana back to Great Tree, so you can go to greattreetemple.org and hit that support button. Our speaker today is Dr. Tori Montrose. Tori Montrose is a scholar of modern religions, specializing in global Buddhism and Japanese religions. Her current research projects include the modernization of Buddhist education in Japan and female leadership in new Buddhist movements. In both her teaching and research, she is interested in the ways in which modernizing and globalizing forces intersect and interact with traditional religious groups. And the title of her talk today, as you can see, is Anger as Teacher, Patience as Practice. Welcome, Tori.
Thank you. Thank you so much to you all for gathering today and to Tejo for another invitation to speak to everyone. Um, so yeah, I'll admit I spent quite a bit of time kind of searching my brain trying to think about what I wanted to do to talk what I wanted to talk about with you all, and I think when this occurred to me, it was like very exciting because it is something that I have found to be um, once I had been exposed to it, it had kind of stayed with me and is a continual like part of the teachings that have been really sticky for me and really helpful and provocative. So I'm excited to share that. I wanted to also give a shout out to Dr. Kristen Scheibel, who's a Buddhism scholar at Reed College, who's the first one who really got me thinking about this topic. Um, but a disclaimer is that this is really not an area in which I'm an expert. As you heard from my bio, what we're going to be talking about today really doesn't have much to do with, particularly, especially with Japanese Buddhism or modern Buddhism. But there'll be pieces of that. But this is really a space in which I'm still very much a student. Um, from both a studying perspective and a practitioner perspective. So I'm learning along with all of you about this, but I wanted to share some of what I've encountered. So today I want to talk about a a monk named Shantideva and his very famous work Bodhicharya Avatara, The Way of the Bodhisattva. We'll primarily be looking at his work, but at the end, if there's time, I'd like to explore a modern practitioner's take on the topic of anger as well. His name is Lama Rod Owens. Um, so I'll start by just talking a bit about Shantideva and who he was. So Shantideva was an Indian Buddhist monk who lived around the beginning of the 8th century. He was born Shantivarman, the son of a royal chieftain in southwestern India. And he was encouraged by his mother, who herself was believed to be an incarnation of Tara, to become an ascetic. And she encouraged him to become an ascetic, and he took her encouragement and began to study the science of Manjushri for 12 years under a teacher. And then he goes on to join the monastic Nalanda University, and he was given at that university he was given the name Shantideva. Um, this is a picture of him delivering the text that we're going to talk about today, The Way of the Bodhisattva. But the kind of mythical origin story of this text is that his fellow monks at Nalanda were very critical of him. From the outside, they thought he was very lazy, basically that he, just one of those kind of slacker students. They felt like he was taking up space. Um, and so they thought they would kind of trick Shantideva and kind of reveal him to be, to be a slacker. So they invited him to give a teaching, and uh, and he accepted. And in order to prepare for this teaching, his fellow monks, built this massive platform for him to give his talk on, which was a kind of a slight. It was designed to kind of mock him because at this time, the larger the platform, the more esteemed the teacher. So Shantideva, being a fellow monk, a student at this university, being given this massive platform to give his talk was meant to mock him. But he climbs up to the top, and you can see the platform there. There's a portion of this text where he's understood to be delivering it while levitating, which is what's captured in this image. Um, but he climbs up to the top of the platform and he stuns the community. He preaches the Bodhicharya Avatara for the first time, um, the way of the Bodhisattva. So that's the kind of, mytho-historical origins of this text. Um, and Shantideva is thought of as a representative of the Madhyamaka or middle way school of Mahayana Buddhism, which is one of the early schools of Mahayana in India. Okay, so a little bit about the text. Um, so this is designed, the text that he delivers as this lecture at Nalanda, supposedly, he serves it as really a practical guide for aspiring bodhisattvas, those who vow to attain awakening for the benefit of all beings. And there's 10 chapters that move the practitioner along the bodhisattva path. So the first 3 chapters are dedicated toward bodhicitta, awakening mind, um, how to guard it and cultivate it. And then chapters 4 through 9 are dedicated to the perfections. And then there's a culminating chapter at the end that's a dedication of merit to all beings. So that's the structure of the text. There's a lot of translations out there. The one that I'm drawing from today is from the Oxford World Classics series, and it's translated by Kate Crosby and Andrew Skilton. But there are other versions. I believe Shambhala might have one. And in one of the English translations, there's a pull quote at the top, or not a pull quote, rather, but a blurb at the top from the Dalai Lama, who essentially says, if you read one book about Buddhism, it should be this one. So, it's a highly prized text in a lot of Mahayana Buddhism, but especially in the Tibetan tradition. Um, so the I mentioned that the core of the book is centered around the different paramitas or perfections, which you already mentioned Dana Paramita earlier in your intro, but there's several different lists of paramitas, and so depending on the tradition, we might be working with 6 or with 10. So these are the 6 that Shantideva that is working with, and of course it starts with generosity and moves into ethical conduct, and the third one is patient endurance or kshanti, and that's the one that we're going to talk about today in relationship to anger. That's the one that Shantideva is talking about in chapter 6. It's translated as the perfection of forbearance, but for kind of dry reasons we won't get into, unless you're a linguist. I think patience is a more serviceable term that we'll use throughout the talk. Forbearance is, even Shantideva doesn't use the term that is getting translated here as forbearance, except for the title. He uses the word that gets translated as patience more. So I'm going to be talking about patience. But if you return to the whole text later and you see that it says forbearance, you'll understand that there's a little bit of a translator distinction there. And then the other perfections here are joyful effort, meditative concentration, and wisdom. These are the 6 perfections in the tradition that Shantideva is working within. So what is patient endurance, kshanti? So importantly for our purposes today, the biggest takeaway is just that it's kind of juxtaposed with anger. So it's seen as anger's counterpart or counterbalance. That in and of itself was really revelatory for me because I had never thought about patience as being the opposite of anger. I don't know exactly what I thought would be the opposite of anger, just kind of intuitively, but patience was not it. Maybe peace or calm, maybe love, but patience was not top of mind for me. So that was just just to just to put those two ideas together in the same space was really interesting for me. Um, and the idea of Kshanti is understood as a deep resilience and calm in the face of life's challenges. And there's really three forms of practice that Shantideva talks about in this chapter. We're going to look at a lot of specific examples that he gives, but from a broad overview, the three, and these are being pulled out also by Crosby and Skilton in their translator's intro. So the first is enduring suffering. So in order to practice patient endurance, one form is staying steady through personal pain and frustration, um, learning to coexist with suffering, in a way that doesn't derail you from your practice, but in fact is the practice. The second one is dharmic patience, and that is patience that is informed by reflecting on the Buddha's teachings. And he does this quite a bit throughout the chapter, where he'll call on these really deep philosophical reflections about the self and interdependence in order to remind us why it's important to have this patience. So kind of linking the fundamental teachings of the Buddha to the motivation, why we should be patient. Um, and then the last practice is patience toward wrongdoing. And that's staying calm when others treat us poorly. And he talks about this a lot, and we're gonna unpack this as best we can. This is gonna come up, but I'm just curious. I'd like to make this as interactive as possible. So I'm just curious if anyone, looking at this list of three forms of practice, if anyone wants to share, like, what's the hardest one on this list for you, or what do you think is the hardest of these three? Anybody want to share?
Wrongdoing.
The wrongdoing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Enduring suffering because it's so subtle.
Mm,
Like I don't even realize I'm not enduring something sometimes. It happens so subtly and so fast.
mm. Well, thank you. These are good things to think about. Maybe at the end of this, we'll have you'll have some pearls of wisdom from Shanti Deva or from Lama Rada ones that might maybe will help with these aspects. All right, so there's another piece I want to just highlight from the translator's introduction that I think that has stuck with me a lot too, and I think especially in a lay community, you know, this I think this is a good reminder that the translators pull out. They say more radically than any other fault. Anger alienates one from the very beings whom a bodhisattva has undertaken to save. So I just find that really, I find that very impactful. This idea that why, why do we need to tackle anger? Not all, some of us have greater struggles with anger than others, but I think this question of sort of why is it important to address in Buddhist practice, I think is really well said here, at least in Mahayana Buddhist practice, right? If the Bodhisattva path is something that's important practice for someone, then this idea that anger is going to kind of alienate you from other beings. He talks about it as kind of um, almost like amnesia to the concept of interdependence, right? that you're almost temporarily forgetting about your interdependence, and that's partially what causes anger. So, um, all right, so Shantideva has a lot of curiosity around anger. He's exploring in this chapter what is anger, what causes anger, and what can be done about anger. And I want to say at the outset that I think some of his answers in might not sit comfortably with with everyone. Certainly with me, they don't always sit comfortably. But I think they're still interesting ideas to grapple with, even if, even if they don't ultimately resonate with you. But I think some will. Um, Before we get started, looking at what he has to say about anger, I want everyone to sort of think about a pet peeve of yours, something that gets you angry, but in a small, everyday way, not in a, you know, um, news and current events kind of way. So what's a minor thing that is a pet peeve of yours? And I'll ask at the end, maybe we'll have some time to talk about what they are. But just for now, if you can think about what what's a pet peeve that you have that creates small scale anger in your body. And then, you know, what is it, but also where does it show up in your body? Where do you feel it somatically? Um, yeah, so if you can just think about that for a minute while we're talking about Shantideva's points of view about anger. Um, okay, so the first thing, and I think this is how he starts the chapter, and I think this is quite obvious to a lot of us, that anger is destructive. But Shantideva wants to emphasize just how destructive it is. So he opens the chapter by saying, this worship of the Sugatas, which is another word for Buddhas, generosity and good conduct performed throughout thousands of eons, hatred destroys it all. So here he's talking about Buddhist practice. He's talking about two other paramitas. Um, he's saying, all of this hard work that you're working towards as a bodhisattva, hatred or anger is going to destroy all of it. And then he follows that up by saying, one's mind finds no peace, neither enjoys pleasure or delight, nor goes to sleep, nor feels secure, while the dart of hatred is struck in the heart. So you may have heard this, the Buddha talk about the darts of suffering before. This is a very popular metaphor in Buddhism. But here he's talking about not really the dart of suffering, but the dart of hatred, as just kind of nagging at us and keeping us from being able to find peace and pleasure and even rest. So he really wants, people to understand from the beginning that of course it's destructive, but it's destructive toward, that which bodhisattvas are seeking most, right? Which is all the practices, and later he'll talk about how it interferes with the bodhisattva vow too. Um, okay, and then another kind of facet of anger that Shantideva talks about is that it is impulsive. Um, so he says, as this sharp pain wells up, though unsought for, so though unsought for, wrath wells up against one's will. A person does not get angry at will, having decided, I shall get angry, nor does anger well up deciding, I shall well up. And then he says, whatever transgressions and evil deeds of various kinds there are, all arise through the power of conditioning factors, while there is nothing that arises independently. So I think this is another important insight about anger that I hadn't previously thought about, which is that unlike other emotions that we might have an easier time anticipating, anger oftentimes kind of comes out of nowhere. It shows up unexpectedly, right? Um, and that it's hard to will anger. I don't know if it's impossible, like Shantideva's saying here, but it's not usually something that you're kind of intentionally manifesting or creating. So this impulsive nature of it is an aspect that he wants to kind of highlight, because I think it has implications for practice later. Um, but I wonder too, if people, what do people think about this idea, this last stanza where he says that, anger arises from conditions rather than choice. Um, I wonder if anyone feels like that lets the angry person off the hook. Um, do you feel like that gives you a sort of pass when if the anger is a result of conditions, um, uh, does that release you from some sort of responsibility with the anger? Um, just a question I had. Um, and I'm also curious if there are other aspects of anger that you all can identify that maybe Shantideva, in this very sort of curated list I'm giving you, has kind of not included. What do people think?
I think with anger, it's got this delusion that it feels like power,
Mm,
because it can actually change something. You know, you can really shift a room using it, and for good or for bad, but using it unskillfully. So there's an association with power.
mm,
Yeah, the image of the dart also reminded me of like the poisonous nature of anger. Like I can't remember. There's a Dharma talk someone gave maybe a couple months ago where they were talking about like the second arrow, where
mm,
it's like, yeah, like you're whatever the thing that first hurt you, that's the first arrow, and then
mhm.
you got angry, but then that anger is just like putting more arrows in yourself. Um, yeah.
Something
Yeah.
that I noticed with anger is that there is seems to me to be anger at somebody or something and like blaming,
Mm,
and the interdependence helps me like kind of cut through that anger by realizing like that person is not to blame, and if I keep just taking a step back, I'm just angry at existence or angry at God or angry at everything. And at that point, um, it kind of just helps me let go of the anger and accept that like this me just blaming it on one person and their laziness is not really true. Like it's a wrong perception.
yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that's kind of previewing some of the other pieces of it that we're going to talk about in a minute. This idea that, especially that the counterbalance of the interdependence teaching, Shantideva really wants to highlight that um, uh, that who is to blame in a situation where anger occurs. So on the one hand, I want to, just foreground that I think there are situations where that kind of discussion can be really um, uncomfortable and maybe will remain unresolved for us about this question of blame, especially with larger things, not, necessarily these smaller pet peeves that we're talking about, but with systematic injustice and things like that. I think it becomes a more complicated discussion. Um, but I appreciate everyone's thoughts. I also like this discussion about power. I hadn't thought about that, but I think that's a really good um, insight as well. Um, all right. So, and yeah, this one of the kind of I mentioned this sort of discomfort is that Shantideva is quite blunt about making it clear that in a way anger is deserved. That if something happens to you to make you angry, that you sort of deserve it. And again, I don't want to necessarily be endorsing that. I just want us to kind of grapple with what he's saying here. I think there are times where this can be a really good lesson, and maybe times where it's more complicated than that. But here's what he says. He says, previously, I too caused just such pain to living beings. Therefore, this is just what I deserve. I who have caused distress to other beings. His the knife and mine the body, the twofold cause of suffering. He has grasped the knife, I my body, at which is their anger. Blinded by craving, I have grasped this boil in the likeness of a human figure, which cannot bear to be touched. In that case, when there is pain, at which is their anger. And then finally, he says, um, some commit offenses out of delusion, others, deluded, grow angry. So, who among them should we say is free from blame? Or who should we say is guilty? Um, so, what do we think of this framing? And I think sometimes it can be helpful to kind of keep it at the level of maybe the pet peeve. Like, does anything change when you think about the thing that kind of makes you angry on a small level? Does anything change when you try to apply this logic that Shantideva is sharing to the pet peeve that you had in mind? And maybe not.
I was thinking about my pet peeve was when a young man in an oversized truck gets behind me somewhere and is tailgating me.
Mm.
A
Mm-hmm.
regular occurrence in my area.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I think like, all right, this kid is just really confused, like it, and he's gonna hurt somebody or hurt me or hurt something, and that's gonna suck even more. It clears something,
Mm-hmm.
instead of being like this laser focus, like almost like the anger has this direction and this target. It simply like goes in a bigger and more diffuse direction, but softens it.
Mm. I love that. Yeah. Yeah. Shantideva says, if you're going to hate anything, hate the hatred, which is making me think of that, what you're saying, kind of diffuse. Yeah. Anybody else? Okay. We'll keep moving along. So, um, okay. So then to this question about what can be done about anger, several of you have already shared some of the ways in which you have dealt with your anger in moments of frustration or irritation. Um, so I'm trying to give it sort of this alliterative framework. So we're going to have a couple of T words. What can be done about anger? This one is train. So the first thing that he emphasizes really early on is that you have to start small. That if you start at the thing that makes you angriest in life, you're not going to get very far. That you have to start with these things. So he says, "There's nothing which remains difficult of it is." Oh, sorry, that's a typo. There is nothing which remains difficult if it is practiced. So through practice with minor discomforts, even major discomforts become bearable. The irritation of bugs, gnats, and mosquitoes, of hunger and thirst and discomfort, such as an enormous itch, why do you not see them as insignificant? So again, this idea, and this is why I'm asking us to think at the level of the pet peeve, because it's a small thing. It's usually fleeting, and this is similar to how Shantideva's coaching his readers to think about how to start with practice is to start with the minor discomforts, um, uh, and use them as really important practice points, that they're not wasted practice. Um, Then he says, when this is another T, so tend. He says, when a house is burning down and the fire has spread toward the next house, any grass or such in which it might spread is dragged off and taken away. So when the mind is catching alight with the fire of hatred as a result of contact with something, it must be cast aside immediately for fear that one's body of merit might go up in flames. So here, going back to this idea, that at the warning at the beginning that, all of your practice can be wiped out with hatred. He's saying that, the earlier you can identify this phenomenon, and I think that's why it can be helpful to think about where it lives in your body, because sometimes we don't always mentally identify the anger. We feel it first in our body. So feeling this anger, thinking about, immediately, trying to catch it as early as possible. Um, uh, like clearing the brush in a fire. So tending to it, not ignoring it, not letting it fester, because then it will grow, right? Um, and then this is the part where I think it gets really interesting. This is to me, really the most interesting contribution that Shantideva makes, is about what can be done about anger, is a kind of reframing. Um, he says, on account of them, because I am patient, my evil is considerably decreased, while on account of me, they experience the long-lasting agonies of hell. So he means, in other words, that because they've done something harmful to me, they are going to have karmic consequences and I have the opportunity to practice patience, I'll have meritorious consequences. So he says, really, it is I who am harmful to them, and they who aid me. So why, slippery mind, do you turn it the wrong way around and become angry? So I find this really fascinating, this kind of idea of reframing. Some of you, I think, have already have already had this insight. I'm hearing it in your comments, but this was really impactful for me to think about. And he goes on to say, um, um, the virtue of suffering has no rival, since from the shock it causes, intoxication falls away, and there arises compassion for those in cyclic existence, fear of evil, and a longing for the conqueror. So, um, this is very early on in the chapters. This is verse 21. He's saying that, suffering is a teacher, right? And I think we all know that um, to various degrees. But here he's bringing up again that, if somebody is causing you to feel anger and to suffer as a result, they are awakening in you compassion, or have the opportunity to awaken compassion. So he says later in the chapter, therefore, since he helps me on the path to awakening, I should long for an enemy like a treasure discovered in the home, acquired without effort. And that I added the italics there to emphasize it. This idea of longing for an enemy um, has just stuck with me ever since I read it. Longing for an enemy like a treasure discovered in the home. Um, I wonder what people make of that.
I think, but Steve was talking about blaming and how that somehow is something for our conditioned mind to grab onto and
Mm.
It's an opportunity to practice something. Like when you go to the gym and you lift a weight heavier than you can lift, but you keep working up to it, and then eventually you get it. That sometimes, we're all gonna fall into that, like, blame and be angry that we're angry and amp it up, and then every once in a while you'll make this breakthrough where you can kind of like flex and lift it, and your true strength gets revealed.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's and this is the insight that I think he makes, that was really kind of a huge um awakening for me, when he says basically that a lot of the other perfections you have control over, initiating those practices. Like, you can decide, I'm going to practice dana right now. But you can't always pick actually almost never can you pick the time and place to practice patience. But when it arrives, this is what he says, like, not just long for an enemy, um, like a treasure discovered in the home, but acquired without effort, that it comes to you, but you don't know when it's going to come, right? You can guess, there might be certain environments that tend to make you more angry than others, but you can't proactively seek those opportunities. They come to you, and that's where the kind of gratitude for that opportunity to practice comes from. And I think that has a really transformative message there, that when something that normally makes you angry is suddenly like, oh, yes, I get to practice sort of transforming this anger. I think it just, that was just really interesting to me. I had really never thought of it that way. Um, I have two young kids, and they give me a lot of opportunities to practice patience. And I remind myself of this teaching, like I'm like, okay, I'm being, this is my opportunity. I'm being given this opportunity. So they are like treasures in my home, giving me they're not my enemies, but they definitely give me opportunities to practice patience a lot. Um, and then, so I included that, the quote we just talked about, at the top of this one. But he goes on. I just want to kind of, uh, continue here. Um, he says, I should long for an enemy like a treasure discovered in the home, acquired without effort. Both he and I, therefore, receive the reward of this forbearance. It should be given to him first, since the forbearance was first occasioned by him. And I think if there's anything sort of more bodhisattva like than saying, the person who made me angry should get the merit for my patience practice, right? Um, that's a deep a deep practice. And then when the transmission of Buddha qualities comes equally from both ordinary beings and from the conquerors, what logic is there in not paying that respect to ordinary beings, which one pays to the conquerors? So conquerors here, he's referring to, you know, Arhats, teachers, enlightened beings. But he's saying, we give a lot of credit and reverence to these Buddhas, to these teachers, but we ought to give as much credit to ordinary beings because they're our teacher just the same. Um, and then he continues by saying, yet the best aspect of the development of Buddha qualities is found in relation to ordinary beings. One should worship ordinary beings in accordance with this aspect. Moreover, for those friends who give immeasurable help without pretext, what better recompense could there be than propitiating beings? One should do it for those whose sake they dismember their own bodies and enter into the Avicii hell. For that reason, even if people are extremely malignant, all that is skillful should be done for them. So there's a portion that we're not covering today, but there's a portion where he goes into talking about how destructive humans are to their own selves, the way in which they are so harmful to themselves and their bodies. And he talks about suicide and addiction, and he says, we beings are suffering in so many ways, and so how can we be angry with one another? We're all suffering to the most extreme extent, right? He uses those examples. So here he's sort of calling back to say, for those whose sake, who are sort of the most harmful to themselves, if those people should be malignant to you, we should, even more, we should apply skillful means and help them. So I think, just a very kind of deeply compassionate view of anger here and of beings that can cause it. So we had this kind of, he presents these kind of different approaches, this train, like start small, tend, cut it as early as you can, address it, and then turn, this kind of transform or reframe these opportunities of anger as real practice sites, and having gratitude for for the opportunity and for the people who've caused the anger within you. So I wonder which of these practices, it sounds, I mean, I wrote this before I could hear some of your responses. It sounds like some of these practices are things you already maybe do at times naturally. Um, but I wonder if there's anything in there that you maybe are, there's ones that I think we're naturally inclined to do more of, and then ones that we struggle with more. So maybe one you haven't tried in a while or that you've never tried. Um, is there, a practice that you've already been doing that you find really useful or helpful along these lines?
Tending to that anger in my body just by feeling the physical, like with mindfulness, just in a calm place or like while sitting,
Mm,
just feeling it and kind of tending to myself in that way with kindness rather than the mental formation of what I'm angry about, just the feeling of it.
mm-hmm.
Where my mind went for me of I'm not sure which category, I'm trying to figure out which category it falls in, is if I think about the example of this person tailgating me, like, I know I can come to awareness about, interdependence, and, there's just this person here who's probably confused about all kinds of other things, and I'm not acting impulsively. But then, like, the turning of it, like, what is the right action there? Like, I was thinking, if I just get out of this person's way, like, maybe then he goes and hits somebody else. So, but if I stay in front of him and just go under the speed limit, like, I'm just making it worse. And I'm like, it's interesting to think about, like, what is the spontaneous, and maybe it's different in every situation, but what is the spontaneous right response to
Mm,
kind of turn that in some way? And I can turn it in myself, but, like, maybe there's a larger response that would turn something. I'm not in control of that person, but what's the turning? And it was sort of interesting to watch my mind kind of think about what's the right response there.
mm,
Yeah, I remember Tejo was saying something. At some point we were talking about like doing the bells for the Doan practice and how like it's so easy to get those wrong because they're very particular. And like especially in Japan, they have a tradition of kind of like not telling you if you do something wrong,
mm,
which can be really frustrating. But the way that Anju-san framed it was she was like, what you're doing is you're training them to watch. You're training them to like become aware by not telling them, and it's sort of like, yeah, you're right. Like you have no control over someone else's like karmic path and like their practice. And it's like, yeah, all you can really do is just kind of like be patient and let them figure it out because like whether in this life or in another life, they'll figure something out.
yeah, I think about that really moving image of the woman standing in front of the police in during the 2020 protests, and she was is I'm people were calling this image, she's sort of standing in this really kind of disarming, brave stance, and there's all these like heavily armed police officers kind of in a line in front of her, and she's sort of just kind of standing. And in a way, there's something about that photograph that feels like she's disarming, right? She's turning, um, in a place where there's so much anger going kind of every which direction. And so I think to the question about like what's the right, oh, I think Zoom thought I was giving a thumbs up because I'm using my hands. The question of what's the right action, like besides the kind of internal work, Yeah, I think it is, moment by moment, and we never know exactly, if we've made the right decision, but I think sometimes just making that internal change can have this real ripple out effect. I mean, we all have seen it in different parts of our lives. Um, I had this experience when I was teaching English in Japan as right after college, where I was assigned to a school and I was supposed to work with this teacher, and everyone warned me that she was like a really miserable person to work with, and they were like, "We're so sorry. You're just gonna have to endure it, she's really cranky and she doesn't want to be there, and like, just do your best." And I remember being really confused by that setup. Like, what a way to throw someone into the work environment. But I just approached her with complete blank slate, open mind, um, and I could see some of the tendencies that people were talking about. But um, because because I guess maybe I was up for this challenge of kind of how I was gonna approach her differently. I watched her, respond to me so differently than she was responding to other people. So I think, in a car, it is so hard, right? Because you can't really energetically, it's harder to sort of to really feel shifts with people. But I think in our day-to-day lives, there's a lot of situations where even just a sort of a turning to the body, as someone was saying earlier, or um, a mental shift that you make in your own mind, I think can have a really outsized impact um, in ways that really, I think, can make a big, larger impact. Um, so uh, let's see, we have till 11. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm just gonna hop to a little bit to give another contemporary example. Uh, are people familiar with Lama Rod Owens? I think he's relatively local. He's in the Southeast. I know he sometimes does residencies in different places, but um, so I think Lama Rod's work is getting at this question of kind of what's the difference between kind of eliminating anger, like cutting anger out, uprooting anger and transforming it. And so Lama Rod is from the Kagyu school of Tibetan Buddhism, and so certainly he's worked with this text. Again, in the Tibetan tradition, The Way of the Bodhisattva by Shantideva is a seminal text, but he wrote a really fabulous book called Love and Rage: The Path of Liberation Through Anger. And he has a little, I think, a different, slightly different take from Shantideva about how to approach anger. Whereas, and we'll talk about the comparisons in a minute, but um, here's some words by Lama Rod. He says the first quote is from a talk that he gave at the Harvard Divinity School about his book, and he says, "We're not trying to erase the anger, but we're just trying to remember the love as we're experiencing the anger." So I think we've already talked about that, how that functions in our lives a little bit, remembering the interconnectedness, remembering the suffering of others, and um, so, and then in the book itself on 161, he says, loving our anger invites it into a transformative space where it emerges as the teacher. And this is where the talk title I borrowed from Lama Rod's The Anger is Teacher. Um, if we bypass this precious opportunity to enter into this transformative space, which is the space of tension, anxiety, and sometimes terror, then we're missing something. So I think, and I really recommend the book. It's really wonderful. It's filled with a lot of personal insight and teachings about anger. If this topic is interesting to you, I think the book would be really a good read. I think what's interesting to me here, that's a kind of a distinction from Shantideva, is that I read. I made a little table here. Um, Shantideva, I think, is really thinking about, like the dart analogy, kind of removing anger. It's something that needs to be kind of uprooted. Shantideva talks about anger as kind of always irrational, impulsive, that, just doesn't kind of anger doesn't really fit within the bodhisattva paradigm, right? Like it is an opportunity for practice, but as soon as you can kind of conquer it, get it out, right? Um, but Lama Rod, I think, has a little bit more of a nuanced take. He talks about the anger as being a bodyguard standing in front of hurt to protect the vulnerable. He talks about the root cause of anger is unattended hurt, right? We that saying, the truism that hurt people, right? Uh, and he really talks about that anger contains information, that it's data. It's a signal that something has been violated, right? Um, and that the approach should be not necessarily to just eliminate it, but to befriend and listen to it, um, in order to reach the underlying heartbreak and healing. So, if Shantideva's approach, I think there's some really interesting insights. But if it doesn't fully land with you, maybe Lama Rod's approach is more your style. But those are kind of two really interesting, I think, approaches and uh, ways to think about anger. Um, so yeah, I mean, I didn't really give a lot of time to really explore Lama Rod's um, uh, teaching, so we don't necessarily need to talk about which one we think is, more instructive. But maybe for those that are familiar, if they want to share what might be what they maybe also find helpful about Lama Rod, the approach here about, you know, thinking about the woundedness, the hurt, and about kind of sitting with the anger rather than uprooting it. What do people think about that?
Um, I think I think that for people maybe like who are oppressed, that's probably a better path.
Hmm.
I think, because I was just thinking, I was like, when I was hearing about like removing the anger, I was just thinking about like just like there's men who just do like atrocious things, and maybe if they had that to remove their anger, like people who kill their whole family or something, like if they could remove their anger, I think those are the people who need to remove their anger. But I think like women or like people of color or like just people who are getting like violence against them, I don't think that being totally passive actually does anything beneficial. I think that you kind of like no, you shouldn't be angry for no reason, but like you have to transform your anger into some kind of power and like boundaries in your instincts and not just like bypass it, because I think when you do that you're like you're doing it's more compassionate to be angry at that point because you're actually helping people, I feel like. um or like even to react or to have strength and to like push against something and be like, no, I'm not letting this happen. Like I'm not like gonna be like sweet about this, you know?
Hmm.
I don't know. That's just kind of what I took from it.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I think we haven't talked at all really about righteous anger, right? And I think Shantideva doesn't really address righteous anger. And I think Lama Rod's teachings, I gave very, very abridged, just a couple of quotes, but Lama Rod is someone who really is grappling with righteous anger and the utility of anger that allows for that. And I think both can be useful, right? In some situations, I think, you know, these this idea of thinking about the enemy as your teacher can be, really powerful and transformative. But I think with like larger um, systemic injustices and places for righteous anger, I think we need, to have maybe some other perspectives and voices like Lama Radoan's perspective. I think it can be really helpful. So thank you for that. That's
I
all I
think
have.
they're both, oh,
Go,
go
please
ahead.
go for it.
They're both helpful, and I don't resolve into one or the other. Like the sticky edge I see in the righteous anger is, and I work as a psychotherapist, so this is why I see this all the time, and where someone's anger then becomes their identity, and everything gets seen through the lens of woundedness. So if there's any discomfort, it's kind of like the princess and the pea. Like any discomfort becomes a wound. You are then, the harmer, they are the victim, and it just becomes this narrative you cannot escape, or it turns into rageahol, that impulsive use of anger that people are just drunk on because it feels so powerful. So I think there's a sticky edge to that too, where you have to kind of, it's about maybe skillful use, skillful means. How do I use this skillfully for the benefit of all beings? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. The closing image I have here, you may or may not recognize, but this is the one of the scene from the Buddha's enlightenment where Mara is attacking him. And I love the detail in a lot of the depictions of this scene where Mara's throwing his army's throwing all the weapons, right? And they're all being transformed into flowers before they reach the Buddha. So I don't know, I thought that as a kind of fitting um, uh, fitting image for what we've been talking about today. But I thank everyone for your amazing insights and thoughts, and I hope this was interesting and helpful to some.
Okay, as for announcements, I don't really have much. The talk that's next weekend is Randall Pride Daigu is going to be giving a talk about visiting Vimalakirti. And that's really all I have. I do just want to put it on people's radar that we're still looking for someone to take over Creighton's Thursday evening meditation in person. So if you can commit to doing that or just kind of help out in the rotation, just let me know. My email is info@greattreetemple.org. Yeah, that's what we got. Do you want to get back to the mirror? Yeah.
May the merit of this practice
May the merit of this practice
benefit all beings
benefit all beings
and bring peace.
and bring peace. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Tori.
Thank you, Tori.
Thank you.